circle is using restorative practices to foster racial healing. And I am so excited to have three esteemed and wonderful panelists with us here today. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to jump right into the questions. So our first panelist is Dr. Desiree Anderson, and she's the Associate Dean for Diversity and Student Affairs at the University of New Orleans. Before coming to serve as the Associate Dean, she worked as the Director of the Intercultural Center at St. Mary's College of California. Dr. Anderson earned her PhD in Educational Administration from the University of New Orleans, studying the use of campus-based restorative justice practices to address incidents of bias. She recently completed a book chapter in Colorizing Restorative Justice, and she's also on staff at the Center for Restorative Justice at the University of San Diego. Welcome, Dr. Anderson. We're really excited to have you here with us today. Next panelist is Sassy Achiman. She identifies as a queer biracial woman of color with a disability. She currently serves as an equity and inclusion consultant for CUNA. Prior to this role, well, prior to that, she has previously served as the Bias Response and Advocacy Coordinator at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And there she works on supporting and advocating students who experience bias or hate incidents. She has experience working with transformative and restorative justice initiatives around issues of interpersonal conflict, racism, and white supremacy. She has facilitated numerous social justice trainings and restorative conversations with an emphasis on identity development, racial justice, and healing. Welcome. We're so happy to have you here with us today. Our final panelist is Sidney Morgan, and she's been working as a restorative justice practitioner for 17 years. She first began her restorative justice journey in Portland, Oregon. She is certified in conflict mediation and has facilitated ongoing mediations and restorative processes with families, neighborhoods, corporate and nonprofit organizations. Experiencing the school to prison pipeline through her juvenile justice work, she saw how restorative justice made a powerful impact with the families she served. Sidney has trained, coached, and supported staff throughout the Portland Public School District in restorative justice practices and racial equity. She started her own consultancy firm in 2018, working with organizations to support race, equity, and restorative justice work for organizations. So a big welcome to all of our three panelists. And I will jump right in, and our first question, and this is for all of you. Can you talk a little bit about your work or projects and how you have used restorative practices specifically to foster racial healing?
I guess I'll go first. It's one of the few times where I'm like, having the last name Anderson is not great. So again, my name is Dr. Desmond Anderson, and my work since I've been back in the city of New Orleans, I haven't really gotten a chance to be a practitioner in this work as much as I was when I was out in California. But a lot of my work really in kind of the last couple of years has really been around really thinking about how we use restorative justice in this type of work, and how I feel like my work broadly now has kind of become like critiquing it, not in the sense of like, I don't want people to use it because I love it and I'm passionate about it, but I've seen it be abused, if you will. And so I think my work now and my projects now and the work that I've been doing, the works that I've been writing have really been about really questioning the way in which we implement, because this kind of like fad, if you will. And so it's this thing that is really powerful, and it's a beautiful tool, and it can be really healing and trauma informed, all those types of things. But if we're not really doing our own work as facilitators, and we're not really putting in the efforts to kind of really structure and frame what it is that we're doing, then it ultimately loses its purpose and its role. But previously, when I was working at St. Mary's, a lot of the work that I was doing there was with our bias incident response team. And so using the restorative practices and restorative justice to really engage with people when these incidents were happening, because in just in life, and also specifically in higher education, right, when we have incidents of bias, they're not really policy violations. So how do we address that? How do we create spaces for that in those communities? And it was able to use kind of RJ for those practices, and then beyond that, thinking about just creating ongoing kind of circles or communities in which we're really just talking about the things that we're experiencing. And so creating specific spaces for people to engage with one another, to be able to share how they have been impacted by either incidents that are happening in the moment or just kind of the ongoing history of oppression that they are experiencing in their daily lives. And so I'll stop there because I know there's two other people that need to share.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Anyone, Sidney or Satya, either one of you can go next.
Sure, I'll go next. And I might have kids dive bomb the back of me because that's just the way it works right now, right? So in relationship to the work that I'm currently doing, specifically since we've been in COVID world, I've been holding a lot of healing space for folks, a lot of racial healing space for folks across organizations. One thing that I've been noticing in the organizational space is where organizations are looking for a more relational way of repair and being with each other. So while mediation, which is a valuable practice in its own right, might have been what organizations have been using sort of to figure out how to heal some harm in a way, they were finding that it wasn't as fully a whole as restorative justice process can be. And I really appreciate Ms. Anderson sharing that, the overuse or the inappropriate, I feel like, use also of restorative justice work as well, is quite possible in these scenarios and situations. And so I come into the processes or the request for process and ask, do you know what restorative justice is? Do you understand it? Do you understand what it means in this process? And what are you actually looking for? Because it might be that RJ is not your answer. And I think that as a practitioner, though, again, I love this work, just as Ms. Anderson was saying, I adore this process. I love it. It's amazing. And it's not a silver bullet. And it's not a practice that can just be broadly stroked across any situation. And so we have to ask those critical questions of, is this process what we need? And is this the process that folks are really requesting? So I find myself sort of in that space. And then also that oftentimes the work I'm doing with organizations is diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so underlying of that are bubbling up issues of race that have happened or that are currently happening within organizations. And so I find that restorative processes are a great way to talk about how to repair, how to acknowledge harm, and also how to repair the relationship piece. And so that's sort of where I'm living right now with organizations is folks are looking to put both proactive and repair processes of RJ into their organizational frameworks.
Thank you, Sidney.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for sharing, Desiree and Sidney. Sorry, I just started, as Neijma was saying, I just started a new position with in the corporate world, and I'm doing DEI consulting with a large company, and I've been trying to think about ways that I would infuse restorative practices into this work. I think inherently it's part of how I approach any of the the work I'm doing around the work in quote I'm doing around equity or social justice as a term broadly. But prior to this role, I began sort of becoming introduced to restorative justice and restorative practices when I was working at DePaul University in Chicago. And from there, after partaking in and facilitating some spaces where, whether it was named as a restorative, as an RJ circle or space, or whether it was utilizing restorative practices for engagement in conversation, critical conversation around identity, and partaking in some circles where harm had been caused amongst colleagues and myself. And that was sort of my first introduction to it. And I ended up working for a nonprofit that was contracted into a high school in Chicago. And I was facilitating, it's so interesting because the title was the Restorative Justice Specialist, which I feel like Desiree and I met at a restorative justice conference in like 2017 or 2018 in Oakland. I forget which year it was. And we both like, I feel like we both like always talk about, and like, especially in that space, was like, what do you mean specialist? Like how, what, like there, like how, like there's no way to like claim this, you know what I mean? And I felt like that was my first introduction into kind of the way in which institutions like to co-opt this work. And Desiree has written a whole chapter about this, of, you know, how this happens in higher ed. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent. This is how my mind works. But in the high school, it was a stark contrast of the work I was doing on the ground with these young folks and the staff and administration in the school, and a stark contrast between the difficult and beautiful work that was happening on the ground versus the nonprofit I was a part of. But the work that was happening on the ground was always centered around racial healing, by the fact that I was working with young BIPOC, primarily young Black men and women who were, and faculty and staff who were coming up against each other in the school system of Chicago, which, if we talk to school to prison pipeline, is so common, right? And so I can talk more about that later, but basically was doing that work, ended up going to UW-Madison to work with students who were experiencing bias and hate incidents, and used restorative practices to process what incidents happen with folks who had been harmed, and see where there were opportunities to bring in the respondents or the folks who had caused the harm for conversations or circles with the people who had been harmed. So oftentimes I will say with like all of the work, it was mostly primarily focused around, because of the identities that the people were carrying, it was always around racial healing, right? Because like we can't just separate the different parts of ourselves. So a lot of it was rooted in that work.
Thank you so much. And this is for anyone. What tools, strategies, or frameworks have you found to be most helpful as you think about using restorative practices to foster racial healing? And that could be as specific or as general as you want to make it.
I think one thing that always comes to my mind, and it's kind of really the impetus of kind of where the book chapter really came from, was when we think about racial healing, we're constantly thinking about this structure that we're in. And so how do we use restorative justice, right, which is a very different structure than the structures that we've been a part of, right? So we in a culture, right, we're in an individualistic society, but restorative practices is rooted in like this idea of collectivism, right? And so part of the work when we talk about racial healing is getting back to this idea of collectivism, of like we're all a part of the solution, we're all a part of the problem. And I think that that's also what makes this work really difficult, because sometimes we are applying that individualistic lens to the work of restorative justice, and then to the work of racial healing. You did this thing, so therefore you have to fix this thing. And it's like, yes, and there's a whole system behind the behavior that led to the issues. And if we're not doing the work of really getting to the root stuff of how we all contribute to the behavior that's being allowed that contributes to racial harm and racial trauma, then like, what's the point, right? So like, what's the point of doing, like the healing part isn't really going to happen, because it takes like this kind of like symbiotic relationship. But also that work means that you also have to do the work with the people who have been harmed, for them to be able to understand that we have to have compassion, and we have to be open to hearing how the people who have caused us harm, you know, have been a part of the same structure. And I think that that's what's really hard about this work. And so the previous panel really talking about the community building aspect, and that is so important to this work, that like, if you're not doing the community building part of this and you're only focusing on the isolated incident stuff, then you're not really doing restorative justice work. Like it's not going to be successful in the long term. Like, yes, you can maybe piecemeal it enough and get at least enough resolution in that moment, but it's not going to have long-term effects. It's not going to have a lasting impact, and it's not really going to get to the healing part of it. It's only really going to address that specific moment. It's like, okay, I feel fine for right now, but then I go home and then 2 weeks later, stuff comes back up for me because I didn't get it addressed. And so I just really thinking again about how do we start thinking about who we are as a collective, and how does that collective framework show up in the work that we're doing. And so it's not really a framework, but it's really that state of mind that has to be in the work that we're doing when we're engaging in this in racial healing work.
Thank you so much. Sidney or Satya, either one of you wanted to chime in on this one? I think that's, go ahead. Go ahead.
I can offer, these were like 2 tools, correct, to use? Kind of, is that what I heard? Okay, sorry, I like opened the chat box and then I realized I got a little distracted. I would say 2 things that for me are really important to consider is number 1, time and intentionality. So thinking about the fact that this work requires an investment of time and being very intentional. And because it cannot be a rush process. It's weird to even say that some of the things that I've been a part of were, you know, naming them as RJ or whatever. I mean, that's a whole nother probably discussion, but, or, you know, from a framework of someone on the outside who like wants you to get something done, like it feels gross because there wasn't enough time and intention put into it. Not because any of like myself or another person didn't want to put that time into it, but because we were under the constraints of a system we were working in, and it felt kind of gross, right? And it felt like it was almost causing, like it can cause more harm when you're not taking time and being very intentional about the process and where you're trying to go, where you've come from, where you're trying to go. That would be my number 1. The second thing would be, as a facilitator or a practitioner, someone involved in the process, you have to do the work of exploring your own identities and what that means for you to enter that space. I'm seeing Desiree and Sidney be like, yes. So I feel like y'all know more than me in that way. But I feel like for me, it was like so important that as a non-Black woman of color, I was like, hey, like, I'm working with a school that's the population of students is like 98, 99% Black. And as a nonprofit, there's no discussion or, you know, intention around exploring our identities as facilitators who are coming into these schools, who are not a part of these communities, and expecting to facilitate racial healing, which we don't even name, by the way, although I know that that's what's happening, right? Like, it's like, I was like, oh my God. I mean, like, hopefully, luckily, like, I have like a framework to know that, okay, like, I need to examine who I am, how I show up, right? And the fact that I'm like on a constant journey of like deconstructing anti-Blackness, right? Transness, like all these things that I like have inherently are a part of who I am because of the system and the world that I've been born into and grow up in. And if I don't do that work intentionally and name that, as a facilitator and a practitioner, I'm going to cause more harm. Like, that is not, safe spaces aren't real, right? But there's not a way for me to even enter and create a brave space, right? If we want to use that naming, if I don't do my own work. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think those were really important points. So I think what we're hearing is, in terms of tool strategies or frameworks, the importance of having that collective mindset so that we're not thinking about this one incident and this one, but what is our culture really here, and how are we approaching this as a collective entity? And then the time and intentionality, I think, is really important. And I think that might feed into the next question a little bit, but even in doing this work to sort of like dismantle white supremacy, we are in fact feeding into that, right? So this idea that we have to do it now, we got to use it to fix it now, and not putting the time into it is really important. And we talked about that in our groups earlier this morning, that if you don't spend time on the community building and the trust building, then what are we really doing, right? So it's important to put equal time and attention to both. And then I think that last point, you got to do your work. You have to do your own inner work, unpacking, relearning, unlearning, if you want to engage either as a facilitator, or even if you're just using restorative practice sort of like in everyday. The importance of doing your own inner work, I think, is really important. So the next question, I think, feeds really well. And I'm also looking at some of the Q&As. So Dr. Anderson, you have a book chapter in which folks talk about their experiences of race and racism and colonization around restorative practices. So I think one of the things the book talks about is how white supremacy often impacts restorative practices. And so I want to hear, if you can, and others can chime in too, talk about, one, what are the ways in which white supremacy impacts restorative practices? And then two, how can we use restorative practice itself to dismantle this white supremacy and cultivate healing? So I'll start with question one. What are the ways in which we're seeing white supremacy impacting the restorative practices movement?
Yeah. I mean, so I think what I've already talked about a little bit was this, and also what Satya just mentioned too about like this time issue, right? Like we're putting in these time constraints that we need to make things happen quickly because our adjudication process or whatever process we have in place, it needs to fit in to these existing models. And it's like, well, yeah, there's ways that which we can definitely start our processes by integrating restorative practices into the systems that exist. But the reality is, if we're trying to fit RJ into our current systems, that is white supremacy at work, right? Because that you can't RJ into a white supremacist system is only going to become part of a white supremacist system, right? So like you, so it's like, yes, like we can, in order to kind of get it in. And I think that also gets this idea of like participation and buy-in. Part of it is that you do start to incorporate little bits and pieces in. And then once you're kind of in there, then you actually start having to dismantle the ways in which we actually did things, the way in which we think our processes have to work. And so that part of that buy-in, part of that like structural piece is having to reimagine our ideas of justice and accountability. It means we have to shift the conversations that we're having about what that looks like when we're talking about who, you know, what is community and who gets to be a part of that community. And I think that that's also part of the white supremacist work of RJ, especially in higher education, right? Like who do we say is eligible, right, for this? Because the facilitator in a way is a gatekeeper. And I'm like, I don't know if you're ready, or I don't know if, you know, you would be a good fit. And that ends up being like this tool to keep certain people out of getting, you know, the benefits of this practice. But also this idea of like, if we're in that same system, I may assume as a part of the kind of like larger committee or like larger community that exists, that person who has caused harm is not worthy of redemption. And therefore, because they're not worthy of redemption, they're not worthy of, you know, these practices, right? So when we see harm happen that way. And on the flip side of that, it becomes a system where maybe it's only used, right, to help people who are already privileged get out of trouble, right? And it becomes seen as that way. And so if we're not really doing that work around thinking about what does accountability look like, if we're not doing that work of understanding and reimagining justice, then it does become a tool where people who are privileged already basically get to like say, I'm sorry. And then we are like, oh, we're so proud of you. And then you move on, and then we actually haven't done that work. And so I think someone in the Q&A asked about like, how do we, you know, like the empathy is important, but how do we make sure that the person who's been harmed is not having to do the educational work? And so the thing I emphasize a lot in that, in the book chapter really is about like the implementation process, that your facilitator, like if you're not doing the work in your pre-conferences or in your pre-meetings to really help unpack all this stuff, then you've already failed. Because the person who's caused harm shouldn't get to the space where they're meeting the person who they've harmed, not already prepared and have not already understood the ways in which, or be able to articulate how they have impacted a person, the historical context for that, et cetera. And sometimes that might mean you need to ask someone else to come in and help you do that if you're not prepared to do that as a facilitator. And that's okay to a degree, but really you got to be doing your own work to do that, because you can't always rely on your diversity and equity person to always come into that space to do that work for you, because it's everybody's responsibility. And so again, that's also part of that dismantling of white supremacy, is making sure that it is everybody's responsibility and it's not just your DEI person coming in and doing that educational work.
Thank you so much. I think one thing that I want to stress is, again, going back to the time and intentionality. And Dr. Anderson talked about this pre-work. And for those of you thinking about doing this, you don't just jump into a circle. You don't just jump into a conference, particularly when harm has occurred. There's a lot of pre-work that goes into it. And then the pre-work is meeting with the folks, the person who's done the offending, the person who's been harmed, having a conversation, preparing them for the circle. I think that's where we see a lot of like this, again, white supremacy. We want to rush it and we don't take the time to do the pre-work. And then when it doesn't work, it's like, well, we're not using this again, right? But we haven't taken the time. And so I know this doesn't delve too much into the specifics of the pre-work, and we're just touching on this, but do know that, you know, upcoming trainings and such will focus and delve more specifically into what that might mean. I'm wondering, Sidney, if you wouldn't mind taking the second part of that question, is how can restorative practice itself be used to sort of dismantle this systematic oppression and cultivate racial healing?
Yeah, well, first I'm over here like Dr. Anderson, I'm in church and I'm like, amen and amen to everything that she was saying. So one of the things that I've done, and this is partly an intersection of DEI work, I think, and restorative justice work, is racial affinity. And part of the healing, I think, of people of color is our internalized racial oppression. And that really, in my opinion, should be worked out in community, not in mixed race spaces. And that's a personal opinion and experience of mine. So folks can agree or disagree with that. But I believe that in those spaces, we have opportunity to work on our collective healing as people, and really dig into the white supremacy that is within us. I mean, we've all been in the water for a while, right? And so how do we daily work on that with each other? And the isms that exist within us and within our own community. So I think for me, around that, fostering racial healing internally to the collective of people of color or BIPOC folks, and also then what it looks like when we come back together as a mixed race group of folks. And I would caveat first that we have to examine the level of consciousness that we have or don't have. We have to examine our racial consciousness anyway, because to assume that we can just come together and people are going to just automatically be restorative is just not true to me. I have yet to experience that in my time. It takes some conversation, some work, some internal work, to really get to a place that you even understand or want to know, and your consciousness has to be examined. What do we know? What do we not know? And what beliefs am I carrying that tie into how I show up? And so we have to examine those things. And that's part, to me, of racial healing. And that I think we can do as a multiracial group. I would just offer that it's not inherent. And so that's a work that we all have to dig into, both individually and collectively. So 2 parts. One, I think racial affinity and racial healing is an important piece of our work. And also that examining the quality of our consciousness and what do we know and not know, and continuing to put that in the forefront.
Thank you. So I think that's a really great point, using or creating racial affinity spaces, and then incorporating maybe what we did this morning, like the check-in circles type thing in those spaces is one practical thing that we can do to foster racial healing. I know that this can be overwhelming. There's a lot that goes into restorative practice, and particularly the folks, the attendees here, some have had training, some may not, but I'm wondering, are there any, and this is a question from the audience, are there any tangible strategies or tools that may be sort of like simple next steps that can be infused into different systems? So this person is asking specifically about how ways to remit the impacts of implicit and explicit bias against Black and Indigenous children who may present outside of stereotypical gender norms. But I would say, even as we think about that in larger context, right? Like, are there any tangible tools, and whether we're talking about circles, questions, whatever, that you can offer if people want to begin to use this as a tool for healing? And not just if you're facilitating, but, you know, if you want to hold meetings, if you're having conversations, etc.
In my experience, when I worked for the school district that we named earlier, one of the things that we did in the primary or K-5 schools, in the proactive space for circle work, was around just getting kids in an understanding of accepting of difference, right? And doing some proactive work before we have a conflict. And I've heard this, you know, throughout this whole program you all are having here today, is the importance of that proactive work. So what can we do? How can we bring in different things to support community building, circle work, and activities for our young kiddos? Hatred's taught. It's not inherent. And so how do you bring forth understanding that acceptance and difference is what we want to have? And you do that in different activities that I've seen teachers get extremely creative, everything from using stuffed animals and telling stories to reading books by BIPOC authors who are children's book writers, and bringing in those you know, filling our education system with BIPOC writers and things like that, and bringing those pieces into the space. You know, we forget the history of our education system. We forget that, yes, we had Brown versus Board of Education, but what we don't remember is that a whole entire community of educators, Black educators, were without jobs. So when you think about that, and we tie that to today, right? Why we don't have more BIPOC teachers and educators, right, in our systems, and why we have predominantly white teachers in a predominantly BIPOC, you know, kiddos in our schools, right? So when when we don't see that pattern, then we can't interrupt that pattern. And so part of that is, in this space, bringing in all the different resources that are available to us now in that proactive space, so that we have some tools when, in fact, we are working with our kiddos in the ages that you just mentioned, when a harm occurs.
Thank you so much. Does anyone have any other sort of practical strategies outside of the K through 12 that you might want to offer, either Satya or Desiree?
Not so much. I think one thing that I have come across as I've engaged in this work a lot is that there's some consistency, right? And if we are consistent with our practices, then we can infuse it any and everywhere, right? It's the same regardless of what community or population or topic or issue that is there. It's right, but it's about our due diligence of how we're preparing for it, right? And if we're kind of following the steps, right? Like the beauty of RJ and the curse of RJ is that, right, it's a framework, right? So there's not a like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, but there are some essential elements and practices and pieces that are like the crux of the work. And if you follow those pieces, right, then it will be viable, right, in anything that you're going to be doing. But that means that we really have to spend time really cultivating that within ourselves. Like, how are we even just using restorative language when we're communicating with people? So shifting how we address and talk to people, right? So even like start getting in the habit of your own management style, like, right, instead of going into like an accusatory tone, asking the what happened kind of question, even like within your own staff, whatever, getting in that and being it as a part of that habit. And so I think that this also then addressed one of the questions in the box, is that while yes, like doing your own kind of anti-racism, anti-oppression work is important to being able to understand the lived experiences of the people that you're going to be working with. What's also really important is that you are doing the work of like cultivating that space in like those pre-meetings or those pre-conferences or in those racial links, where you as the facilitator, having someone coming in, being the people who are doing that kind of educational work, so that it doesn't become the work of the people in that space to have to do educating for others. It's really about the space for them to just amen and like thank you and like and yes and snap or whatever else it is that they need to do in that space. You know, so I think when we talk about like implicit bias or you know, working with, you know, just part of it is just really being able to set up space to deconstruct what we think is quote normal, right? So how do we spend time engaging in that conversation? And really it's about that setup, right? How do you start off with the community building with that kind of soft, like get me into the space where people start to feel comfortable kind of breaking down kind of their barriers around who they think is in the room, right? Because that's also part of the problem, because we see people and we make assumptions about who's there, and we then operate, or how we communicate them with each other is based on how we perceive everybody. So we've got to spend the time breaking that part down first, so that people can see people as just a person who is here to listen and learn from each other. But that doesn't happen in our current society, right? So we've got to, how do we spend some time doing it? So it's a building process. So again, going back to community building, community building, in order to be able to really do that stuff well, you've got to find a central community that you're going to be working with and spend a good amount of time just breaking down barriers before you ever get to start talking about implicit bias or, anti-Blackness, internalized homophobia and oppression, or whatever else it may be. Because if they're not comfortable with the people that they're seeing in front of them, then it's not going to be authentic enough to really break that down and then actually get to that healing part.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think what we're really getting out of this is that this, as you just named it, it's a continuum, it's a process. It doesn't exist in isolation. So we can't just wake up and say, okay, we're going to do a circle. Oh, okay, we're going to do a conference, without like having done all of that different types of work, whether it's through training, conversations, etc. I want to ask and two more questions before we wrap up. And this is coming from the audience. When harm happens to others, and in particular people of color, and there's a need for healing, sometimes people or a lot of times people want to focus on being punitive to the offender, right? And since restorative practices is not necessarily inherently punitive, some may struggle with using this as an approach because they may think it's not real accountability, it's soft. So when you think about, harm happening to people of color and a need for healing, and people not really wanting to use this because they kind of want to focus on being punitive to offender, what do you say, or what advice do you have? And Satya, I will have you start us off.
I think it's a really good question. I'm thinking about who would be questioning the practices, or who would be upset by it, and where and how, what is that person carrying with them that is allowed, or like that's having them feel so resistant or unsure about a restorative process. I think that's dependent on your identities and experiences, can be, I would think I would approach that very like differently, right? If it was like a BIPOC person versus like a white person, right? Because I do recognize that, like, for a lot of folks, the only way we think about justice, and like the only way we think that, like, we've been taught, right, to think that our current criminal justice system, like, provides like resolution or provides justice, like, right, like when someone's handcuffed, thrown in jail, when someone gets a sentencing, like that is it, we've done it, right? When in fact, like, that's not healing. Like, that doesn't, like, I mean, but I also don't want to be quick to say that that doesn't provide healing to some folks in some form or fashion. But I think that, like, punitive, like the idea of being punitive and either or thinking is inherently rooted in white supremacy. And I would say that for a lot of folks, the current justice system doesn't provide healing. But I would examine why, what is that person carrying with them that is making them feel like this process isn't going to provide, enough of a punitive outcome for this person who, or, against this person who's caused harm. Like, if it's a BIPOC person saying that, Like, I think that's rooted in like a history of that person experiencing trauma and trauma and trauma and harm and harm and harm, and just like being exhausted by it, right? And like, I think that like we have to hold space for that, and like really think about like, you know, like not dismiss that, right? Like that person is like coming from a place of trauma and harm and is like not sure about this process. I mean, a lot of folks, like, this is like in some circles it's like common, in some other circles it is not, right? Like this idea of like, oh, like, shoot, like if I like can like actually come from a, like, if we can all like come from a place of like love with accountability, right? That there might be another possibility here. Like, it's a reimagining of our world, right? If like a white person is uncomfortable about the process happening, I would also like want to hold space for like where they're coming from and all of that. But I think that like there's more of a I just think that I mean, obviously we don't know like anyone's personal experiences or backgrounds, but I think that I would just say that I would have a different approach if it was a BIPOC person who was feeling that way because of the history of harm and trauma within BIPOC communities, if that makes sense, in terms along the lines of racial healing and racial justice.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Thank you so much. So we have to wrap up, and one takeaway. So people who are listening in, you know, again, there are different stages of their restorative practices. Some have never done it. Some have implemented it, you know, different phases. So for those who are really interested in wanting to do this and move forward, what is one piece of advice, either do's or don'ts, particularly for those wanting to use it to foster racial healing? Dr. Anderson, I will give you the last word on this one, simply because you talked about being in a space of critiquing. And so I wonder if you can just give one or two pieces of advice, do's or don'ts. Thank you.
I think the biggest thing is doing your own homework, right? Spending the time to cultivate yourself, even if you end up not being a facilitator in the end. But really thinking about how you show up, what you bring to the table, what you're lacking, what you're missing, right? Your understanding of, you know, the history of the trauma and experiences of people of color in America, or whatever context you're working in, that, you know, if you're not doing that kind of investigative work within yourself, then to be able to engage in racial healing work is I'm like, I don't know if you're going to be successful. And I think the big part of it too is also really is practicing, right? And so thinking about like, what are the kind of, I don't know what to say, soft or easy spaces, because it's never easy work. But where are the ways in which you can enter into kind of practicing how you facilitate and how you engage with people. That becomes an essential part of it. And again, as I mentioned too, if your restorative justice is a framework, or it's a part of, it's a being, right? It's a thing that is, it's not a thing that you do, right? And so how do you incorporate that into who you are, right? The restorative lens should be a part of how you manifest yourself to the world, how you are engaging with people on a regular basis. So if you're only like really using those reflective type of questionings, if you're only asking like the what happens and like how have you been impacted only when you're in the circle process, I question like your commitment to this, because it is a way of being. And the more that you are engaged into that and you're part of your lived experiences, the easier it's going to be when you're engaged in that process. Because let me tell you, you're going to fail. It doesn't matter how long you've been doing this, you're going to come across a failed process, but there's ways in which you can recover. If you're living this, if it's a part of who you are, if it's a part of how your everyday language is a part of how you're communicating with people, then you'll be able to recover from it. But if you're only turning it on to engage in the moment, you're not going to be able to recover as smoothly or as quickly. So that's my advice.
Thank you so much. I felt that so deeply when you said restorative practice is a way of being and not a thing to do. And I don't have to add, there's nothing else for me to add to that. That was beautiful and that was powerful. And I hope that that's piece of the takeaway that folks had from this discussion. And so to those of you who have never done this before and are not familiar with tools or techniques, I know our various campuses who are involved in this there will be definitely additional opportunities for more learning in terms of what does this look like on a practical level. We wanted just to introduce this conversation today so we could begin to be thinking about this process. I really want to take the time to thank my panelists, not my panelists, panelists. I thought this was a really good conversation. I hope that folks got some nuggets that they were able to take away and hold on to. I know certainly I did. And now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague to let you know about next steps. But this specific part sort of ends our panel discussion. We are going to move into the closing circle, but I know there's a couple of pieces of information that Ryan needs to share. Thank you all to the panelists, and thank you all for attending today and being with us. We really appreciate both the panelists and the attendees' time.